to write a number of books that in some ways or another reflect my experience, my community's experience, my family's experience. And that wasn't something that I would ever have thought I'd been able to do as a student. I don't know what your lives are like. I can imagine they're pretty tough in terms of going to school and balancing work and school. I know when I went to several different community colleges in Houston, because in fact I was lucky. I went to I guess I was lucky. I had mixed feelings about it. I went to a private all-boys Catholic high school in Houston. It was a college prep school, and I think I was lucky because it was a really good school. There was a lot of wealthy whites there, and they had a couple of African Americans, a couple of Mexicans in each class. But what happened is I went into that school feeling very confident in who I was, a very good student, and I came out of there feeling almost ashamed of who I was, feeling very, I had a very difficult time there dealing with racism. I didn't have the language to speak back. I came out of there, instead of feeling empowered to face the world, I came out of there feeling very like I didn't want, if that was college prep, I don't want to go to college. I didn't want to have anything to do with that. I felt alienated, I felt disconnected, I felt almost embarrassed of my roots because everything that I heard at that school was negative about Mexicans. And so I went to work full-time for several years. And it wasn't until a few years later when I took a class on small engines at a community college and I was in a school setting again that I was like, oh yeah, I like going to school. I like learning. I forgot how much I like to read. And I started reading novels again. So I started going back to school and working full-time. I was working 55 hours a week and taking classes at night. And it was very hard. I came from a family of 8 kids. A few of us had been to college, but our parents didn't go to college. They knew education was an opportunity for social mobility. They wanted it for all of us and sacrificed a lot to send us all to really good high schools. But they were, part of my rebellion as a kid was, well, let me take this out of my parents, even because I didn't like high school. And the way for me to punish them was to decide not to go to college. And what I was doing was, in fact, punishing myself in many respects. But nevertheless, I got to a point where I was ready to go to college, and I had to work really hard to be able to do that. I didn't know you could drop classes. I would go and, I'd miss an exam because I had to work late, and I'd think, okay, well, shoot, I'm going to fail because I was a big, I was half the grade or something like that, and so I just wouldn't go back. And so my own transcript, even though I'm a professor now, if you look back at my transcripts of my community college days, I have 4 or 5 F's on there because I just didn't know you could drop a class. And but then my life changed one day when I walked into a class on Chicano literature. And I was 25 years old. It was the first time I've ever read a piece of literature by somebody of Mexican descent in this country. And it changed, that whole class changed my life because all of a sudden I realized that we had a different, even though I loved to read, I grew up loving to read. Reading was like my escape. I would go into the house or stay up late at night reading to think about the world around me, to think about, reading was an opportunity to, travel in ways that I couldn't travel, literally I could travel in my mind. But all of a sudden I was reading stories and poems and novels of people whose experiences were very much like mine and my family. And all of a sudden I realized, wow, we have stories worth telling. Something that the curriculum in school had never told me about or given me that. And I saw it, it was bilingual, it was code switching, it was in Spanish. It was just like, all of a sudden it resonated with my life in a way that, nothing in school had ever done before. And that changed my life because all of a sudden I'm like, I want to keep doing this. I want to learn more about myself. I want to uncover my past in ways that I hadn't known about. I mean, my parents raised us to be proud of who we were, but they were born in the 1920s, my parents, and they went to school during a time where they would get punished for speaking Spanish. And I grew up the same way. I went to a Catholic school in the 1960s, and if you spoke Spanish, you know what the nuns did? They would put a clothespin on your lips. And it make you stand up there and look foolish for a while. And so yes, what was the message you took from that? You were a bad person for being different, even though 90% of us in that room were Chicano, And so it was about where we fit. The message we were getting was about where we fit in society. So for me, when I left high school, when I left high school, I had gone from being a very outgoing person because my education had been mostly in my barrio, in my neighborhood, my junior high, my elementary school there, my public junior high. And I had been a really smart student. I was outgoing, I was confident of who I was. But by the time I left high school, I went from being an extrovert to being an introvert. And once I took that literature class, then I realized there were other Mexican-American studies courses I could take in history and sociology and film and all these sort of things. And I combined that with studying English, not English because of the language, but English because of the literature. Because I realized that what I liked to do more than anything was to write. And I liked to read. And somehow they came together for me in that way. And I didn't know, I thought maybe I'd be a teacher, a high school teacher, or business, or different things that my parents had wanted me to do in terms of being successful. But finally I decided I had to do something that I really wanted to do, because I found, for me, all that other stuff was boring. I couldn't imagine doing it day in and day out as, that kind of work. I wanted to be able to enjoy what I was doing. But what I found during that time, this was the mid-'80s, was that reading all that stuff and giving me information, it gave me power to find my voice again, that I could speak up. I had something to say. I had the information when people said something negative about McDonald's. I could say, what? You can do it, and they pat me on the back, good job, even though I probably was hardly able to be heard by anybody. But nevertheless, it was important for me to practice that and do that, and to take the time to develop that skill. And what it did was ultimately gave me the confidence to realize that I had something to say, that I could learn how to say it, and that I could continue a path of education. That when I finally finished, it took me like 7.5 years going part-time to go to school, that I didn't want to finish going to school. I wanted to keep going, which is why I went to graduate school. But I didn't know what to do in graduate school. I didn't even know what it was about. And I missed the process of applying. But I decided to drive up at the last minute to UC Austin and submit an application. And lo and behold, I got admitted very late in the process. So I missed all the funding cycles. I'm a bad example of how to apply to graduate school, because I didn't get any funding at all and wound up with a huge amount of debt. But nevertheless, it was the best time of my life, because I consider came of age intellectually and politically as a graduate student. I learned, even as a student, to connect to the community. I moved away to Austin, but to connect to the local community, to think about education, and relationship to the society around me, to think about the function of higher education in terms of creating social stratification in the society in which there are haves and have-nots. But I learned that it wasn't necessarily the best thing to say, well, I'm going to be a have-not, but in fact to say, how am I going to have and help have-nots? How am I going to open the doors wider? We are able to go to school today because our elders changed policies that often disallowed us to. This may not be true in the Minneapolis area, but in Texas and other places, there's what they call de jure and de facto segregation. De facto segregation was when they had a law and said, if you're African American, you cannot come to a regular public school. But there was also de facto segregation against Mexicans in many schools or in public places where I grew up, where there were signs that said, for drinking fountains, no dogs or Mexicans allowed into restaurants. We would go to the back when we were traveling on the road to buy food so we could continue on our way. And so in that society, things changed because people stood up, because people tried to make this country live up to its own principles of democracy and equality, which there were lots of contradictions embedded all the way back into the very Declaration of Independence. And so being armed with information allowed me to become an advocate for social change, just like others before me had become advocates for social change. I never really imagined that I would be able to, I was very scared in graduate school. I still had lots of problems with basic punctuation stuff, but I had something to say, and I had to learn that I had to become disciplined to fix that stuff, and that I could do it. I just had to take the time and address that stuff. But I guess I would tell you a little bit about the books I've written again. And part of I'll explain why, as a sort of an own journey. This is the first book I wrote. It's called Historia, The Literary Making of Chicano and Chicano History. And it's a book that basically was based on my dissertation in graduate school. And what I do in this is, I had wanted to write this definitive study of the literature of people of Mexican descent, and I knew that in order for people to understand the literature, they had to understand the history. But what happened is, when I started looking at Chicano and Chicano history, which was very important to me, I realized